All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our first Slam School of 2019. We are coming to you from the Studies of Literacy and Multimedia Assembly, which is a special interest group of the National Council of Teachers of English, or NCTE. My name is Nicole Mirra. I'm an assistant professor of urban teacher education at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and the current president of SLAM. I'm really excited to have a conversation today that I think is about a topic that many of you might be experiencing in your classrooms and might be looking for other folks to talk with about, and that is finding common ground in troubled times, dealing with fake news, political polarization, and controversial current events in the classroom, in the literacy classroom and beyond. So I'm really fortunate to have Jeff and Sara and Ben joining me today. I'm not going to say too much about them, even though I could sing their praises. I'm going to have each of them get a chance to introduce themselves in just a moment. I will mention right at the top that if you are interested in this content, we're going to encourage you to join the Studies in Literacy and Multimedia SLAM Assembly. You do not need to be an NCTE member to join. Anyone can join, students, university faculty, teachers, anyone interested in the digital landscape and how we work with multimedia and multiliteracies in this day and age. So I'll give you more information about joining as we go, but we're excited to share resources and conversation on this topic. So I'm going to kind of go down the list as I see it on my computer. So I'm going to start off with Jeff. If you could introduce yourselves to us, and I'm going to ask each person to introduce themselves by telling a story about a time in their practice recently when you've realized or come to a crystallization in your mind that, hey, we're living in a really unique time right now, and this is changing how education is and changing what I'm going to have to do in my practice. So I'm going to start off with you, Jeff.
Okay, hi, thank you. My name is Jeff Sher. I'm a faculty advisor in the teacher education program at UCLA. And I work mostly with elementary teachers, but I work with, I teach critical media literacy classes to all teachers, high school and elementary. And they're all new teachers in the pre-service program. I guess one thing that has recently been kind of an interesting challenge is the way, not necessarily things that are being called fake news, but the way information is being disseminated, so much so that the challenge of knowing what's real and what isn't, but then also the biases and the slants and what to do with the information has been extra challenging. And so one thing I can think of in particular is last year, the 2018 election run-up, the Republicans created a commercial. It was about the Migrant Caravan, and it was full of a lot of insightful language and imagery that really portrayed all immigrants coming up from the South, as criminals and as really bad people. So we used that commercial in several classes, and my students took it to their students from kindergarten all the way up to high school, showing the commercial and talking about it and really kind of taking it apart. And it was powerful. I mean, the fact that something so blatantly racist and so over the top was being put out by, at the end it ends with, this was approved by Donald Trump. So having something from the government saying such really harmful, negative things about the very people in these classes, because most of the kids in LA schools are Latinos. And for them to see this, it was a wonderful opportunity to really challenge and analyze both the structure of it, the choices and images, words, the music, even the tone of the music in the background. I mean, the production quality was really, there's so much to it. It opened up a really wonderful space for the students to get pissed off, to address it, and then to talk about, why this was so wrong and what can we do about it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to introduce Sara to share who she is and what she's been thinking about.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sara Bonner. I'm from Bloomington, Illinois, and I'm currently in the classroom with 8th grade, and I teach 8th grade language arts. I'm also an instructor for Illinois State University, as well as a doctoral student, so lots of hats going on. My story isn't necessarily something that I've taught, which I continue to address. The story I would maybe like to share tonight is when I felt my role as a teacher was really important. And I can recall, to kind of give a little context, I teach in a rural community. The majority of our students are white. They're ultra conservative, a very traditional minded district that I work for. Very few families of color that exist there. I don't go a day without seeing MAGA hats or rebel flags posted outside or inside of our schools. And I recall after the results of the 2016 election that came in, and I had to go to school the next day, and just hearing the chanting in the hallway, lock her up, build that wall. I was devastated as the results of the election had come in, but then to hear my students, echo these things in the hallway, and to allow that and to afford that to be okay, I knew that I had a pretty big job I needed to do. And this is my 16th year in the 8th grade classroom. Up until then, I was a decent teacher, but at that point, especially, I knew that I needed to really be thinking about meaningful and important work, especially when it comes to, my 8th graders would be the next time I would see them, they would be voters. And, I have a responsibility to speak to that as best I can. So a lot of my work that I do really focuses on acknowledging student poses, and then also interjecting different perspectives, because I feel like if we just kind of take time to understand different perspectives, we may have a chance to see different sides, maybe change our views, cultivate some empathy, which you can definitely speak to, Nicole. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like that's a slice of how I can start these conversations with kids that, have never had any type of conversation like this, hardly before. So I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much. And I really like that term you use of poses, because it really speaks to the fact that we can move through poses.
Right.
I'm thinking about Cindy O'Donnell Allen and Antero Garcia and their book Pose Wobble Flow, that this is all going to be something that is constantly in flux, and teaching our students that their views can morph and change over time is really important.
Absolutely.
And also to echo your idea that I've been lucky lately to see teachers around the country, and every single place I go, teachers are concerned about these issues and their students want to talk about these issues, but they're stuck and searching for ways to have those conversations. So I'm really excited that we're here to kind of talk about this through, instead of just keeping it all under wraps or trying to remain neutral, which is not even possible, right?
Right.
So now I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Hello, I'm Ben Boyington. I'm the Vice President of the Action Coalition for Media Education, or ACME, an independently funded coalition of media educators and activists devoted to cradle-to-grave critical media literacy education. I'm also a classroom teacher in a high school in sort of South Central New Hampshire. Similar a bit to what Sara was talking about, although I haven't been there long enough to have seen the outflow of MAGA hats and such like after the election. This is my first year at this school, but it is rural New Hampshire, so make of that what you will. Wonderful place. I love New Hampshire, but we're fairly purple politically, but there's a lot of conservatism behind that purpleness. Sara got me thinking about another story, so I'm kind of having to decide on the fly which story to tell. I think I'm going to go with the first one I had, and maybe the other one will come up later. One of my classes right now is a college composition class. Seniors are doing research papers. The ways in which they process and present news and information is kind of fascinating, almost endlessly so. I had a back and forth recently. I think it's still ongoing, actually, because they're doing multiple drafts. I had a back and forth recently with a student about Antifa. And in the paper, he asserted, baldly, with no citation, that Antifa was a terrorist group. Yeah. And I said, wait. I said, are you asserting this, or did you read this somewhere? So, right, I want to talk with him about how to process and present his information. And he said, no, that's not me. I found that somewhere. And I said, well, can we talk about that? Like, can you show me? So it turns out that what he meant was that Antifa had been classified, apparently by the FBI, as engaging in domestic terror. So I had thought that he was picking it up from, he's a fairly conservative student, or that's my impression right now. I don't know him that well, but I had thought maybe he had picked this up from right-wing news source of some kind. So it didn't. Apparently he'd read this actually in research, and he'd found it. So there's another can of worms about the fact that the FBI is classifying Antifa in this way, never mind that they're calling Antifa a group at all. But it seems to be confusing. I had to point out and ask him to look into the idea that Antifa is not an organized movement. And I had to I felt compelled to also suggest that what he was seeing was a conflation of Antifa with the black bloc tactic, which are, there's overlap, but it's not the same thing. But we were working on information gathering. We were working on processing and presentation. So I had to focus really on how to present what he had read clearly and how he could differentiate between the assertion and the reporting, right? Is he making the assertion, in which case that's a different argument, or is he presenting something he read somewhere? So we talked about how to do that. But what it all kind of came down to is, for me, it seems indicative of a challenge we face in information processing and in precision, combined with media representation of political movements. I still believe that his acceptance of that phrase, domestic terror group, or however he had worded it, has a lot to do with how Antifa is displayed in the news media and especially in social media. I know more than a few people who would state as fact just what he did without questioning it and just blindly accepting what is shown of Antifa in those contexts. So that it led me back to that point of clarity and concern for me about how do we process that and how do we talk with students about it to get them back toward looking critically about investigating what they're being fed by whatever media source they're looking at or by the research they're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much to all three of you for sharing. I feel like folks that are watching right now, I'm sure that each of you have your own stories in a similar vein of when you've kind of realized that we're in a very unique cultural and political moment, and that digital media is playing a particularly important role in kind of blurring the lines between what is fact and what is not, spin, political spin, everything that all of you have been mentioning. And I'm really kind of curious to just kind of talk generally, and we can bounce off of each other. I feel that when I'm also teaching pre-service teachers right now, and when we try to broach the topic of how difficult it's going to be and what it means to help students understand the media ecology right now, a lot of my teachers kind of started with the things that we used to hear, years ago, that I'm going to teach my students to look for websites that have .gov or .edu. This is the way to be media literate, is to not just take, be careful when you're online, make sure that you're going to trusted news sources. But at the same time, I have students asking if the New York Times could be a trusted source, because there are some politically that call the New York Times fake news. And, what our even basis of shared conversation can be when we're so splintered that we can't even agree on a common source or a common set of understandings. I'm really curious to kind of hear what you're all thinking about how digital media is both democratizing voices in some ways by letting so many more voices be heard outside of mainstream channels, but at the same time also being a really difficult space that can actually foster extremism and division and echo chambers. Because I'm sure teachers are kind of, swirling through all of these ideas and not quite sure how to even start anymore, since our traditional media literacy lessons aren't quite enough. And anybody could start us off on that.
Well, I know with my 8th graders, a lot of what's changed from what you had mentioned, searching for the credible source, has really turned into just kind of fostering skepticism. And we do a lot of work with even looking from a historical point of just, unpacking the nature of spin and how this isn't necessarily a new concept. We see this in areas of advertising all the time. So for my students to kind of approach this as an actual concept, we create safe spaces first. We can talk about a tall coffee at Starbucks and kind of nudge our way into conversations and know that spin is everywhere. And then, then we kind of dig deeper insofar as like, well, what would stop other people from using spin? And we start kind of applying that to different areas so that they can kind of maybe process not only the notion of spin, but they also kind of they have room to practice and you know, kind of dive into meaningful, deeper questions that speak to like the notion of skepticism. I think is greatly lost, and I know these past few years have been something that I really encourage kids to really think about.
I really like the way you talk about fostering skepticism, Sarah. I think for me that's the key here. Because like you said, there are new things, there are new tools, there's new technology, things are going faster, there's more of it, you know, there are these different issues. But at the same time, it's a lot of the same issues that we've always had. And it's about questioning all our communication, recognizing that no communication is ever objective, that there's always a bias. And so moving beyond the simply true or false dichotomy and helping kids really ask the questions that will help them better understand and be better prepared to make decisions.
Yeah, I think that skepticism thing is really key. I always talk with students about the difference between skepticism and cynicism, right? Skepticism opens a conversation, cynicism closes a conversation. And I think that's really important. I know that others in my Acme realm have said that in other different ways as well. But I think about these platforms and I think about the skepticism. I used to teach it when I taught a media studies course at high school. It started as a junior senior course. And my arc for students was to try to get them from consumer to critic to activist. That was the sort of arc. Now, activism took a lot of different and very kind of limited modes in a high school context. But the idea was educate yourself, decide what matters to you, do something about it, or be prepared to do something about it. And I think that this is the great potential of digital media, right? Is the ability to disseminate our information, to get our views heard, to gather people together under a banner. I mean, whether you're on Twitter using hashtags and, creating a March for Our Lives and, all the various kind of work that we see being done by people of all ages and across, the cliche, all walks of life. But I think that, part of the problem we run into is that there's a Pollyanna side and there's a dismissive side. And we have to thread that needle kind of. I'm mixing my metaphors all over the place, bad English teacher. But we have to figure out that middle path and we have to say, okay, well, I'm not speaking for moderatism, for being a moderate here, just don't get me wrong. But I think we have to find that central path to say, well, we can't just dismiss and say, oh, it's all echo chamber. Oh, it's all, fake news. Oh, it's all reshare blindly. That's all happening. But on the other hand, there's this great ability to democratize, to expose voices, and to get work done together. We have this great technology to say, look what we're doing right now, right? We couldn't have done this 15 years ago, and even 10 years ago, right? It would have been kind of hard. So we're at this great juncture where we can say, how do we turn this thing, take away those bad behavior, not take them away, but combat those bad behaviors, question those bad actors, put skepticism into our students and into ourselves, instill that, but not skepticism to close, right? Skepticism to open the conversations and lead to deeper action. This is the path for me, and I think it's got to be for us.
And I know I'm going to throw in another question that I'm just thinking about right now based on our conversation, because I'm also having this struggle. All of us are speaking for core values that we're trying to instill in our students, and skepticism is one of those, but also for a greater purpose of, like we said, activism, empathy, compassion. And every time I have these conversations, I think a lot about the pressures that a lot of us are under, and that administrators in schools are under, because when they are trying to kind of talk about these controversial social issues or talk about media or criticize dehumanizing rhetoric like Jeff, like your students were doing around the commercials, and teachers say, yeah, I want to do that, but parents are going to come up and say that, like, this is not your job, don't talk about anything political or anything controversial, just the facts. But we all know that education is never neutral. Like we're saying, every choice we make is little p political, not necessarily big P partisan, Republican, Democrat, but every single choice is a political choice. And at a time when dehumanization and things that are not values of our schools or of our country are becoming more partisan, it's becoming even harder to kind of figure out the lines between how to talk about these things. And so many teachers just kind of get scared and shut down. And I'm wondering what you're all thinking about. Like, I'm thinking I need to speak more to administrators, because there is an argument to be made here. If administrators support their teachers, and understand the purpose of public education. But I also know how hard it is to be in that moment with parents who maybe are seeing education as more of like a transaction where they only want to choose what they want and not to hear voices they don't want. I think it's a really tough time, and I'm wondering how you're all dealing with that kind of in your either personal context or what you have in your mind as the defense you would use for why we need to push past these concerns.
I'm gonna go. Can I go?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I get that all the time. Not from people, but the conversation. I'm on Twitter a lot, and that's kind of where I live sometimes. And I recently had a pushback. I asked for ideas on teaching Huck Finn. You would have thought that I had asked, if I should kill puppies in the classroom. There was some real pushback on teaching it at all. And there was this whole thing about, I was kind of like, well, I'm here and I've been told to teach this and I'm brand new to the school. And, I just kind of have to, I can tweak it. I can, change some things. I can try to bring to light. And what we've ended up talking about actually is dehumanization a lot because of that context. But the pushback from Twitter people, a lot of folks whom I, greatly respect and enjoy and gain a lot from, really were kind of coming at me. And the idea was kind of what you're pointing at, like, well, no, resist, stand up and fight, like, take that chance. And I'm going, well, yeah, but so there's the practical, right? I need a job. And there's the, right, when we all do. And if we don't, we probably wouldn't be teachers because we'd be doing something else with our time. But we need to work, most of us. And then there's that balance, like, okay, if I fight too hard and get fired, and yet if we believe that I'm bringing something important to the classroom, then who am I depriving later of the longer term presence, right? And how am I, kind of almost failing those students by going too far, and finding myself in Dutch with administration. I don't know if this would happen. I don't know how much, trouble I would get into. But because we're talking a lot now about dehumanization, because I'm taking the AP kind of curriculum and tweaking, subverting maybe a little. Oh wait, this is public, right? I don't know. I haven't seen pushback yet, but I'm kind of expecting it. I'm kind of waiting for some, because I have some pretty conservative kids in my classroom, and they're fine with it. They're rolling with it. Although it's funny, I had one student who said to me last week, he said, I disagree with a lot of what you're saying and suggesting, but, I respect you, so I'm not going to, say anything. I looked at him, I said, no, push back. Like, let's talk. Let's have that back and forth. So I'm kind of waiting to see that happen. I agree philosophically with the idea that, we need to be fully social justice oriented. We need to fight the fight. We need to, put ourselves out there. But at the same time, there is that practical edge. So there is a line to walk. And I think I'm doing it. I think we can do it. I think the value has to be in listening to the students and giving them the room to do that questioning and that pushback, and not to be selling an ideology, but to be selling an approach, right? What I want them to do is think critically. And so if I say something sort of, subversively, radically loud and obnoxious to them, I want them to push back, because sometimes I do that on purpose, right? Sometimes I'm deliberately going even farther afield than I actually am. Now, I'm pretty far left for those, compared to a lot of the kids and probably a lot of the teachers I work with, but not necessarily. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, some of this leftism is really just humanity. So, but that's my challenge, is like to find that line. And I think for all of us, Nicole, you said, do we talk to administration? Well, at what point do you do that? When do you make the decision to say, okay, I know I'm going to go farther than I have today. Let me go do what? Well, then you might get squelched. So is it better to ask forgiveness or beg forgiveness than ask permission? Or is it better to upfront air what you're going to do and kind of feel that out? As for parents, I'm ready. If they want to come and ask me why we're talking about it. I mean, I'm not saying anything deeply offensive. I'm not insulting the president. I'm not even bringing him into it. If the kids do, and if the kids bring in that, but we're looking at like fugitive slave acts, we're looking at wanted posters for slaves and sale posters for slaves and from the 1800s. And then to sort of say and let them make those connections to other moments in history and even to the present. That's where we have to go, is like to leave that door open and to create, like Sara, you said, a safe space, to create a place where students feel comfortable arguing, openly discussing and arguing with me. I mean, I said that to this one kid. I was like, go ahead, push back. Like, why are you holding back? Don't play this respect thing with me. Like, I know you respect me. Respect doesn't mean you never question what I say. I'm not God, you know? And by the way, question him too. But, no, like, come back. Like, respectfully argue with me. Yes, because I'm going to respectfully push back on you if you do. So do that.
I would say, to continue Ben's conversation, a lot of what I try and talk about with my students is, and insofar as parents, because right now, I mean, with 8th graders, you teeter on a very, gray area of, they're still kids and they're still trying on identities, but they care about adult topics. So there's a lot of a mixture of things to kind of consider when approaching different ideas in this, weighted capacity. But I invite the parents in to the conversation. If we want to, for example, read a text that has social justice pulls, that may have content that, pushes envelopes, so to speak. I often survey parents. What do I need to know? What can you provide me insight on to know that, how we're going to be approaching this? How can I acknowledge your pose so that I can also introduce other poses? Because at the end of the day, I'm not here to change your belief. You are free to believe whatever you want to believe. However, I do have a role in, presenting different perspectives, and again, fostering this skepticism, fostering this idea of being connected beyond this very tiny, small rural school that we live in. And I mean, while there's a lot of downside to social media and digital media out there, I mean, I use that as such a powerful tool for students so that they can make our small world so much bigger, and they can learn in that capacity. I think as teachers, it's really important on how to structure those opportunities for students and see how tools such as these can empower students to know and learn and question more.
I see Jeff furiously taking notes. Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, this is great. I mean, there's so much. I think several of you have pointed out the importance of how we teach. I mean, the idea that we're teaching using a democratic pedagogy, that we're promoting critical thinking. We're not trying to instill, one specific idea or trying to convince anybody. And I think starting with media is a fabulous way, because there's so much out there happening in the public discourse that our students, their parents, the communities are seeing all the time anyways, that we need to be engaging with. And especially now, you were talking about kind of these troubled times, we're hearing dominant discourses about things that are really very dangerous for our democracy. I mean, just the assertion that the news media is the enemy of the people, I mean, that's very highly problematic. The assertion that climate change is a hoax. I mean, there are a lot of things that are very easily proven with statistics and evidence that are being repeated in the media and not being challenged, not nearly enough. And so I think this is a role that teachers need to play in terms of bringing in, through critical analysis, and getting our students to be questioning or researching and debating these different ideas.
And I would say, to layer on top of that, I mean, as I stated before, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't see, a MAGA hat. For my purpose, why are you wearing that hat? Can you justify the wearing of that hat, or are you wearing it because, is it a social reason? You see other people wear it. Are you, what makes you decide wearing that hat? To me, I feel that students need an opportunity to really answer for what they believe in. And equally so, my experience with 8th graders, they've never been afforded opportunities to really explore what they believe in. And I think getting to the root of their belief system and, kind of teasing that out and having conversations, they may find that MAGA hat doesn't necessarily examine, what they truly believe in. And I think if, as teachers, we don't afford these opportunities to have those self-explorations. I mean, and I'm speaking from a middle school lens when I say this, we're really, disservicing our students in that way.
I love to hear that middle school perspective, because I did a little bit in my training, but I'm a high school teacher. So I think it's fascinating to hear what they're struggling with, and then seeing what that's becoming, in my realm, or the realm that I live in with the slightly older adolescents. I want to go back to that kind of safe space idea. And, you know, safe space gets kind of this bad rep. Like it's become, even just in the public discourse, it's not accurate. What we hear is, oh, it's a place where the liberals cannot have their their beliefs challenged. And, you know, it's for those snowflakes and, you know, all that kind of language. And clearly, Sarah, that's not what you're talking about. And I don't think it's what we are talking about or what I would talk about. When I say that, I want it to be, like I was saying with that young man earlier, that I want him to feel comfortable or able, you know, open to push back, to question me. That's to me what the safe space is that we can all talk about contentious issues and put our hearts and souls as well as our minds out there, because, you know, education is not a cold clinical experience. You know, we need to honor that emotion, and we need to honor those feelings and the humanity of it. So those students need to feel free to push back against me, to argue with each other in the context. The MAGA hat thing is really interesting because that same student, this was the other story, I'll do it quickly. That same student, he came in one day, he was really upset because he had been wearing a Trump 2020 red, not a cap, a winter cap, like a beanie. And he had gotten a lot of guff, he used a different word, from many of his peers. And he was really upset. He's like, look, I don't like the guy. I like his policies, blah, blah, blah. I don't like him. Okay, right. I didn't get into that because the conversation he needed to have right then, or he needed me to not say anything, but it seemed like he needed a conversation. And it seemed to be about that safeness idea. It wasn't about, like, he didn't want to hear me talk about or engage around the depth of Trump and whether we should support Trump or not, or whether he should, or why he did, or any of that. I want to have that conversation with him, but that wasn't what he was after right then. He was after, like, why am I being treated this way? Why are these assumptions being made? He got called a racist walking down the hall. He got called a sexist or something else. And I know the kid, you know, I mean, I've known him for 4 months, 5 months, whatever. He's a good guy. Like, whatever covert isms we all possess, I'm sure we all possess some, right? But he's a good guy. And I would not think of him as being racist or sexist or any of those ists any more than, you know, fabric of society kind of stuff that many of us suffer from. So the conversation I had with him, or the question I asked him was, I'm pausing because I'm making sure I don't say his name. The question I asked him was, why do you think people had that reaction? And then we kind of got into that and dug into that a little bit. And I said, okay. And finally I said, look, do you understand that for a lot of people in our world, the MAGA hat, the red hat, anything with Trump on it that sings Trump's praises is a symbol of hate for many people right now, whether you agree with them or not. And he's, oh yeah, I can, okay. So, you know, I forget where the conversation kind of went. It didn't go very far, much farther than that. Class ended, or it was after class. He had to get to his next class. You know, we were chatting. But that's the safe space part, is to have that conversation, that kind of conversation about perception, right? What are you putting out in the world? And do you want to put that out there? Like you were saying, Sarah, like, why are you wearing that hat? And we have to be careful with how we ask that question, because that could be seen as why are you wearing that hat, right? It's confrontational, but that's not what you're saying. And that's not what I was saying to this kid. I didn't tell him he shouldn't wear it. Freedom of speech, right? Stand up for what you believe in, figure it out, but be ready, you know, to take that heat, because you're going to get it from some people. And he had a complaint about the school being vastly liberals and all of that. But the point was to have that conversation about perception, and to help us think critically about how we put ourselves out in the world.
It sounds like there's definitely that idea that a safe space does not need to always be comfortable. And especially, you know, at a time when it seems so difficult, the models we have on TV and cable news and other public spaces of what it means to try to have conflict that is actually generative and still humanizing. We don't have many of those models. And so it sounds like this is the struggle that all of you are experiencing in trying, because these are young people that we love, all of them in our schools, how to help young people. Because I know when I talk to young people, I'm doing a study right now with young people across the country, and they're trying to, they want to talk, and they're so turned off by the tenor of our public dialogue, and they want to be able to talk to people they disagree with, but without essentializing their humanity or calling them one thing or another. And so this is so fascinating, and I would love to keep this conversation going all night. But in the interest of time, I want to have us, because I want this conversation to keep going online with our audience. I think it would be great if we could kind of close up by having each of you share maybe one a resource that you found, or a strategy, or an assignment you do, or just one thing you would share with a larger audience that's helped you to get, like, it's been a generative, interesting, cool, dialogue sparking kind of resource for you. And we'll start with Jeff.
Okay. We have a website at UCLA. If you go to research guides, it's run through our library, but just put in search media literacy at UCLA, and it's a YRL Young Research Library website that has a lot of good links that we've been trying to keep updated. But as far as kind of one assignment that we've been doing that's been turning out really positive has been having students create memes, because memes are such part of their culture today. It's something they get, they enjoy. They were looking at them all the time anyways. But to have it focused on specifically challenging problems, challenging racism, sexism, different issues. It's very high level to do a good meme. You're way up there on Bloom's taxonomy. It's a difficult thing to do. And yet it's very accessible to so many students. So that's a fun assignment that we've been doing.
Well, I love memes. Thank you for sharing. How about you, Sarah?
So since I pull a lot on perspectives, I use Antero and Cindy's Pose, Wobble, Flow framework to set up what I like to call wobbling perspectives. And so I take the nature of what we used to consider in ELA classes like debate. But if you think about the nature of debate, there's a right or wrong side. Developing like these wobbling panels allows me to look at why people say yes and no. So for example, last year, we're getting ready to start it actually tomorrow, crazy enough, with my 8th graders, but I can recall a panel discussion we had last year with a group, and we had just seen the school shooting in Florida happen, and then the conversations of, should we arm teachers? And so that was the question, and then I let students choose the question. So I posed the essential question of, like, who would care to say yes or no about this fact, or about this question? Who would want to arm teachers? Who would not want to arm teachers? And so with the use of like role playing, we had a chance to use some research. We had a chance to role play, the yes or no, or the pro or con. And so we had a panel discussion inviting these voices to kind of share their perspectives using research. And so from there, I had our audience members, prior to going into hearing this panel discussion. Sorry, this is Sher coming in. I had students acknowledge their pose, would they want teachers to be armed? And so they kind of wrote, on their own poses. Then they participated in the panel discussion, and then, they talked about how they wobbled, how they would have thought differently. And then we also come together and then have them talk about their flow in terms of like how they've changed their mind as a result of participating in this panel. And we do that more of like a synthesis journaling activity that responds to this like role-playing activity. I mean, it goes really well if you can think about the nature of middle school students, the idea of being somebody else and not necessarily being themselves. But then also interjecting some credible sources, interjecting research, talking about real topics that are in news today, offers an opportunity to have students, be able to read about this and know that media offers so many different perspectives on just one topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really powerful. And also to get away from the, like you said, if you just launch students into a debate about a controversial issue without setting it up the way you did, I think a lot of teachers think that's a good activity, but it could easily devolve into something unsafe and hurtful if it's not carefully constructed, because it's not just a free-for-all that you're talking about here. It's carefully made, which is really important.
Right. I mean, when we start, the nature of debate, pro and con, right or wrong. I mean, the idea of a panel and then having those different perspectives, just a lot for, there's lots of people who say yes or no about this, and let's see what they have to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And a resource from Ben.
Wow. I think I have to follow up with Sara on that idea. That sounds marvelous.
I can send you stuff.
But yeah, no, that sounds great. And it reminds me of someone sent me a link about Rogerian debates recently. I didn't follow up on that, but it sounds sort of similar. It's not about right or wrong. It's more about discourse. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to quickly share two things. Sorry, I'm breaking a rule. I'm going to quickly share two things. And neither is really media based. So when I used to teach the high school media course I mentioned earlier, We started the course, actually, I think first day, we engaged in a discussion activity. We used the Save the Last Word protocol, which probably will mean a lot to some of our members or guests. And we read a piece called Willing to be Disturbed by Margaret Wheatley, part of a larger book. In this piece, Wheatley argues that that we must not only be willing to listen, we must be willing to be disturbed, as in have our beliefs shaken. And do that in a kind of, well, what we've been calling a safe space kind of way, right? In a respectful disagreement kind of model. Just to set the course right then, because we're going to be discussing difficult, challenging things that are going to make some of us angry and some of us sad, and we have to be willing to be disturbed. So I start with that. Always a really fascinating discussion. And then sort of tied to that, we get into opinions versus feelings, how that works, because people say that's just my opinion. What they really are saying is that's my feeling most of the time in my experience. The second thing I want to share is something that was suggested to me today by my ACME colleague and our co-president, Allison Butler. She has an activity that I'm now going to steal because it's pretty cool. She called it 2 Assumptions. So in this activity, near the beginning of the course sometime, beginning of the semester, each student sits with someone they don't know, and without talking, they make 2 assumptions about the other person, their partner in that moment. Inevitably, she says, those are nice assumptions, right? But it helps, she says, to dig into our beliefs and what we act upon. And then when questions like, why do you believe that? Or how do you know that arise later, they can circle back to this assumptions idea. I thought this was really marvelous. Finally, partly because members are not allowed to make negative assumptions about one another in the classroom. They can't do that out loud, right? That would be rude, so you have to be careful. They get to have meta conversations about what happens in our heads versus what happens in the public sphere or in the public discourse. So I thought that was a really fascinating kind of tone setting, discussion.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that everything we're sharing tends to get back to this idea of, again, being safe but uncomfortable sometimes, and that idea of kind of shaking our perspectives and taking a stand and being able to listen to others, which I feel like is the core of democratic dialogue. So I would love to know what our audience is thinking. I would love to know other resources that they would like to share. So this is going to be the jump-off point for a dialogue that we hope will continue. This has been an amazing Slam School, and I want to thank Jeff and Sara and Ben for joining tonight. Again, for anyone that's really excited by this dialogue and wants to get involved, go to our website for SLAM, which is slam.education, and you'll be able to find all of our resources there, including the video recording of this conversation, as well as resources. And we promise that any topic that you're wrestling with in your classroom, just contact us. You can email us at slamassembly@gmail.com, and we want to have future SLAM schools based on what you out there are thinking about and dealing with, and we'll bring folks together and invite you on to talk about them with us. So I think this is a pretty awesome first SLAM School of 2019. Thank you for joining, and good night.